This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
Hi, I'm Dean Gation, and this is the Powerful Connections podcast. For over 40 years, I've been involved in planning and building high-voltage projects. My company, DGG5 Advising, is the opportunity maker you need for your energy and construction projects. My guests and I are going to share our experiences and how we have brought projects to successful completion. Today, we're going to talk about planning. We'll review the start of the project from a concept to a ready stage for an RFP. It'll be an engaging discussion. We're going to talk about the front-end activities. My guest today is a very young friend, Lloyd Girman. I say young because he is neither old nor outdated in mind or body. So he is the most realistic person I know when it comes to looking at possibilities. And he is a very active person. I'll ask Lloyd if he would introduce himself to our listeners and give us an overview of what you do.
Hi, my name is Lloyd Girman. I'm from Manitoba. I live in Winnipeg, though I've been commuting. My office is in Toronto. I've been commuting back and forth for the last 35 years, in part because most of the projects that I'm involved in have been around the world and I've had to travel anyway. I also spent a fair bit of time working with a group out of Montreal, and I love Winnipeg, and this is where I live. What I do is, as Dean described it, I'm mostly involved in pre-development on projects, essentially looking at potential projects, opportunities, and trying to, and I will describe it in the following way. My grandfather at my bar mitzvah gave me one piece of advice. He said, you want to be a leader? Find a parade and run out in front of it. And that's been my operating philosophy for my entire career, trying to figure out where the parade is going, what's coming, what's going to be needed in 20 years, in 30 years, and how are we going to get to those points. It's an interesting exercise because it's not an exercise that a lot of people, A, want to finance, or B, think is terribly valuable. And I will describe it again like this. As I run up and down Bay Street and other places saying, the parade is coming, they say, he's nuts. Don't talk to him. And when the parade arrives, they all go, get him, he's a visionary. So I've had a good chunk of my career as a crazy person and a visionary all at the same time. Does that describe it, Dean?
Yeah, that's the one. You've always told me you were informative and entertaining, and you've struck those both right away early. Lloyd is a director at Enterprise Canada right now. Give us a high-level description of Enterprise Canada and what you guys venture out to do every day.
We have an 80-man group on Bay Street in Toronto. We do government relations, we do communications, we do crisis management, we develop programs, we have offices across the country. About 4 years ago, we spun off a group called Northern Horizons Partners. And we spun that group off specifically to work in the North with First Nations around project development. And project development where First Nations have control and capacity to fully participate in projects and fully participate in the real economy of Canada as opposed to being caught in a backwater welfare transfer payment economy. So we spun off this group to work with First Nations across the country. We work on a success fee basis. We're success fee driven in part because there isn't any First Nations out there right now that could afford us. We work for most of them, a number of major corporations across the country, and our fees are Bay Street fees. We came to the view that if First Nations were really going to be able to participate, they needed people like us. And we needed to create a vehicle that allowed them access to people like us. And that's what we've done.
That's fabulous. For those listening, Lloyd focuses on large-scale infrastructure. More specific, he facilitates the front-end items that start the concept, the pre-development work that is the tough part of any project. And Lloyd, provide us a starting point of where you get involved in some of these infrastructure projects. What happens and somebody says, I got to call Lloyd?
I'll give you a broad example, and it illustrates how some of this happens. Pre-pandemic, we were approached by a major fund out of the U.S. At the time, American money was a little toxic around the world, and money has to move always. And so they had done a significant amount of work looking at northern Canada and the Arctic and what was going to happen over the next 30 years. They came to the conclusion that $1 trillion was going to be spent on infrastructure development over the next 30 years. And they approached us asking us if we would be interested in representing them in Canada to help them position, to brand them, to be part of the process so they could see their way clear to that investment. We looked at their studies very carefully, and we thought about it, obviously carefully. But at the same time, we were being approached by Chinese interests and East Indian interests to represent them in a lot of this, especially as it related to the Arctic. And we chose not to. One of our major clients is a Canadian bank. We have significant relations with some other banks. We came to the conclusion that we would represent Canadian interests, not outside interests in this development. The next question that came to our mind for us was, if $1 trillion is going to be spent in the Arctic, how much of that is going to remain in Canada as Canadian wealth and value? And finally, how much of that money was going to end up in First Nations pockets based on the fact that it's their territory being developed? And when I say their territory, I'm just talking about the historic territory. And that was really what precipitated some of the things that we're doing today. We looked at it, we saw what the 30 years would be like, and we determined internally that we had to do a number of things with First Nations to help them develop capacity. And when I say capacity, I mean the ability to have the corporate capability interface with major corporations, not the ability to face with Indigenous Services Canada. They have that ability. Internally, the structures that could participate in a very real corporate way in a lot of the development. And so we developed a plan around that, and we engaged with a number of communities across the country. And we are currently we have a portfolio, a pre-development portfolio that we're looking at today, somewhere in the range of $8 billion, which will be we won't touch a project that isn't at least 51% First Nation owned. So that's kind of how how this emerges. And when we talk about seeing the future, it's from points of view like that.
That's fabulous. And Lloyd, you're hitting a point that I've been making all along, and it's kind of 3 words. And one of them is clarity that comes from all of this, capacity, which is the biggest thing that is happening right now, and the ability of economic development and capacity building in the First Nations and their businesses and partnerships. And a word that, you brought to me many, many months ago, certainty. And
yes.
And certainty to me is risk review and so forth. So the requirements for a project to gain momentum and stability is the pre-development part. And this is the creation and the development of the conceptual plan, and all these desktop studies, feasibilities, mapping to identify the project opportunities, high-level cost general layouts. This is the tough thought process to prove the project has a chance to materialize. And you talk about reviewing the ugly stuff prior to development. Give me a little briefing on the technical term ugly stuff.
I think part of the difficulty, I've worked on projects. I worked one project, took 17 years to get it to the point where it was shovel ready. Okay, that's the ugly stuff.
That's
Dean,
a complicated one.
You and I worked on projects for 7 years to get them shovel ready.
Yeah,
and the difficulty is that period where you have to work, you have to struggle. You take all the elements of a project and you have to sell it to the world, essentially. Okay? Because most of the world will think you're nuts. We did and Dean, we did a project together, which was a major transmission line, 100% First Nation owned. People thought we were crazy at that time. That was 30 years ago. And we struggled to gain credibility for the project. And as we kept at it, and as we kept moving forward, as we kept bringing other participants to the table, the project gained over time, and our ability to brand and sell the project, it gained credibility. The key to all of this, though, is patience. You have to be able to see a project. You have to be able to envision it, but you also have to have the patience to understand that a project of any order of magnitude will never happen until two significant things, especially in Canada, and I've worked around the world, as you know, and it's a little different in other places. But in Canada, a project will not become a project until the politics and the economics merge. Okay?
What a good point.
And you can struggle all you want to sell a project to Bay Street, not going to happen. You can sell it to all you want to governments, not going to happen. But the day the economics and the politics merge, everybody wants to jump on board. Okay,
right away.
I'm going to give you an example, if I could. Am I wandering here?
No, you do just fine. Keep going.
We did a project, Dean. You also know this project. We worked on it for 17 years, and one day in this process, we discovered that the government was forced to fly diesel fuel into a number of communities. We also learned through watching it develop that the winter roads were collapsing, that more and more rolling stock was being taken out of service. The governments were going to be having to fly diesel fuel in for the next 30 years. We did a very quick analysis. We did avoided cost analysis that said, this is what it'll cost to fly in fuel. This is what it'll cost to do a transmission line. 3 days later, we had traction all over the country. Simple. The politics and the economics merged.
The issues that we get into, and a lot of it comes from having the right people in the right place. So there needs to be a significant amount of spending to get to a point where a project can start development. And over the years I've been involved with, and I'm currently helping some new projects start a planning process, I do not enter the picture until you've put in many years of planning, discussions, spending, political will, fundraising. Talk to us about what is necessary to help convince people to get to the project and get this politics and economics to fit so people can say, hey, this is a good idea.
I think part of it's vision. Part of it is, and go back to what we talked about, certainty. In a lot of the work that I do with First Nations, I describe the most valuable commodity they have. It's an incredibly valuable commodity. Certainty. You can sell certainty. That's all banks are looking for, is certainty. But in order to sell certainty, you have to create certain structures that allow for that to happen. But as we go forward, and you just brought up a good example. We have a project. I won't bring people to the table on a project until I know it's a viable project. Once I feel it's a viable project and I bring people to the table, then they see the viability of the project, the professionals, the people who will actually do the development, not the pre-development, but will do the studies. They can see the viability. And that's part of the exercise, what I call pre-development, is being able to create the vision of viability. I worked for one of the largest engineering firms in the world for a number of years. I was senior vice president, part of the management group. That's where I learned my trade. What I learned was we had 150 guys sitting in an office in Montreal. All they did was write proposals all day. They waited for the RFPs to arrive. We had a formula for doing RFPs. But to say to a group of engineers, listen, guys, let's go build a transmission line in northern Ontario along the James Bay coast. and they'd look at you like you were the craziest loon on the planet. But the moment that project became viable, it was amazing how fast they wanted to fire me.
Comes pretty quick.
And assume control of the whole thing, which was fine. I mean, that's what you learn to live with.
Yeah. It's you talk about the people that want to take credit. In all the efforts you put forth, I've always been amazed at the political contacts and political knowledge you have. And saying you are politically connected is the wrong description. Your understanding of policy, your presence in the political arena without being a politician is a very rare skill in existence that I've seen. I know you brag about some of your cohorts at Enterprise Canada, but I've always felt you were the guru. So discuss how you came to the position of being the person people need.
I've been very fortunate, and I'll describe it in the following ways, Dean. I was a deputy minister in the Manitoba government. I was deputy minister of Northern Affairs. I was a cabinet secretary. I loved being a cabinet secretary. Greatest job in the world because you have no administrative responsibility. When I was deputy minister, I had to read things and sign things. I hated it. However, I was also Elijah Harper's deputy minister at the time, and I was the lead constitutional negotiator for the province of Manitoba. So by osmosis, I actually sat in rooms for 2 years. And by osmosis, I learned how the country is put together and each province. And so, I had that experience, and that allowed me to have a particular perspective. The thing about working inside government that I loved was when you look at an issue, you can look at it, you have a dramatic capacity to bring information in, do research. You have hundreds of people working for you whose job is constantly to bring forward information. So I had the luxury of being able to look at various projects. And one of the first projects I did actually was the first transmission line I ever did, which was where we developed the avoided cost model. And that was a transmission line that went up the east side to the Island Lake area to 4 communities. That was pure luck to end up in that situation. But you learn by osmosis. Now, the second thing that happened, when I left government, I ended up working with the Ontario government for a number of years, with the Ontario Cabinet Office. And that's a different order of magnitude. The Manitoba government is smaller than some departments in Ontario. So I managed to learn the inside of the Ontario government. And then the most bizarre thing of my life is, look, as you know, Dean, I'm a non-French-speaking Jew from Manitoba. I ended up as senior vice president and part of the management group of the Crown Jewel of Quebec Corporations. How the hell that happened is beyond imagination. I really learned my trade there. I mean, we, through that experience, we did projects all over the world. That allowed me to get a very strong sense of what infrastructure looks like around the world. And more importantly, it gave me a strong sense of who engineers are and who accountants are and what they do and what they see as important versus the reality of what a project really is, because they never get to the project until very late in the game. And then they're all fighting with everybody else to get in the room. And that's when I started realizing if you were reading the RFP, you were 3 years too late.
Yep.
Okay.
In the milestones of any project, we've talked about the politics and when the money have the ability to proceed. What do you see as the necessary item to convince people they really have a project? When does an owner understand the order of magnitude of what they're taking on?
I do it like this. Look, the center of every project is 8 people. That's it. There's 8 people in the middle of a project. You've got to identify the 8 people first and early. And then there's about 150 people around the 8 people all trying to take credit for the project. But the key is the 8 people. And that's simple, Dean. Relationships. Every project of any size, order of magnitude is relationship driven. It's not balance sheet driven. It's not politically driven. It's driven by 8 or 10 relationships. And 8 or 10 very diverse relationships that bring to the table different perspectives and different skills. And once you have that, once you have created that, and you've created vision, and that's the other sense of this, creating a vision that people can reach out and touch. More importantly, a vision that people can add to and call it their own. Take ownership of that vision. Then you're on your way. Money is never, by the way, just so we're clear, in my world, money's not an issue. Okay? You can find money. There's always money. But if you don't have a vision, if you don't have the capacity to create certainty, you're never going to attract money to the table anyway. So, you've got it's a rolling process.
That's always been the fun part, to listen to somebody say, I want to do this. And I've always gotten projects started by throwing either a design or a map on the table, and all of a sudden they go, oh, now it makes sense. So
that's it.
In all of these things, proving a project, we talk about the order of magnitude of a large transmission project or a infrastructure project. The politics and money are aligned. Now you need to prove viability and bankability. And the best model I know of was the Five Nations Energy Omashkego-Ishkateo project that extended the grid 269 kilometers from Moose Kneed to Attawapiskat under the avoided cost model. At a very high level, is this something we can talk about that people need to understand?
The avoided cost model is something that, as I said, we developed in Manitoba when we were doing a transmission line up the east side to 4 communities. And we looked at it and we said, it's over 30 years, it's going to cost this to continue running diesel up there. If we build a transmission line, it'll cost Y. And we then took that argument and we went to the feds and we went to the province and Manitoba Hydro. I mean, at the time I was a cabinet secretary, so I had a lot of moving around room. It wasn't that I was struggling to get access. And that model proved itself out. We were able to convince everybody that it was cheaper in the long run to run up a transmission line than to service those communities on diesel. Now, today, it's even a stronger argument because you can tap on top of that carbon credits and everything else that goes along with it as part of the modeling. Okay, so that was really the genesis of it. Now, having said that, and again, you've been with me on a couple of projects where we've instituted the same model. The problem is everybody goes, well, avoided cost model, that's simple. Go to any accounting firm, they can whip you up an avoided cost model. Okay? The reality is the model, as I said earlier, is based on a number of things that aren't balance sheet driven. You've got to talk about building, sort of relationships. If you're looking in the north, as you know, you've got to build trust. You've got to do a whole series of things to underpin that model. And that's when you can use the model at the end of the day. But, you sit down in a room somewhere and whip up a balance sheet, throw it on the table, it makes perfect sense. If you haven't done everything else, you got nothing except a bunch of paper.
Yeah. There are so many attractive projects out there now and in the future. And you talked about looking ahead 20 and 30 years and the things we looked at in the 80s and 90s and that we're looking at now. The transmission build in Ontario and in Canada is probably nothing we have seen since after the Second World War in the 40s or 50s. So we're struggling with, the other day I saw a stat that they got to build or rebuild 80 million kilometers of transmission line in Europe to meet the requirements of 2050. What's your thought on all these projects that are coming and dealing with them?
We need to build capacity. I mean, look, a number of years ago, I was doing projects. We were bringing project managers in from New Zealand. We couldn't find enough project managers. We couldn't find enough engineers. We were farming out our detail engineers. So capacity. We need to build capacity. We have in our midst, we have a lot of raw capacity in communities in the north where we can go in, we can work with people, we can do the development, we can create joint ownership positions, but more importantly, we can create capacity. We can do the training and the development so that the jobs are staying here and they are local and they are driving the opportunities in those communities. It's not just transmission. I want to point something out that was really interesting for us around Project View. We're involved in a number of communities, and we did a desktop study of 9 communities. And we looked at their capital needs for the next 30 years. And in that process, we discovered that they would need $8 billion to come to a standard, and we used Timmins, Ontario as the standard. And we also determined that what was going to be available to those committees was $3.5 billion. A bit of a shortfall.
A little bit.
And so we started trying to come up with strategies on how we were going to generate revenues and everything. The thing that never occurred to me that happened, actually, and is happening as we speak, is those communities went very quickly to being a market. All of a sudden, they're an $8 billion market. And all of a sudden, people were interested in figuring out strategies to service that market and come up with financing plans. When you talk about the infrastructure development across the north, it's, yes, it's transmission line. Yes, it's going to be a hydro project. Yes, it's going to be Arctic ports, and it's going to be, but it's also community development that's going to go on, that is going to go on in a major way. We've built most of the infrastructure we're going to build in southern Canada. There's a huge market just north of us.
So you see that as the huge opportunity that's going to happen in this country, and those are the greatest opportunities that we have to ensure happen. And we've talked about capacity, we've talked about certainty. Is there anything else we're missing in making sure these opportunities are successful?
This is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? $1 trillion is going to be spent in northern Canada and the Arctic. That is a fact. I can see it. I can see it all around me now. I mean, 5 years ago, we started talking about this. Nobody was talking about critical minerals. All of a sudden, everybody's building EV plants and critical mineral, and we're looking at building entire communities. Ports, regular scheduled cruise line through the Northwest Passage. The ice on Hudson's Bay used to be 4 foot thick. It's now 18 inches. That's $700 to $1 billion is going to be spent in the next number of years redeveloping the Port of Church. So the question is, yes, this is going to happen. It's just a fact. The question more is, are we going to take advantage of it as Canadians? Are we going to control it? Are we going to be the beneficiaries? Or is all the money going to go to the U.S.? Or is all the money going to go to China? Or is all the money going to go to Asia? We, as Canadians, and for our children and our children's children, and for our partners and our neighbors in the North, the Aboriginal communities and the Northern communities, we have a tremendous responsibility here to ensure that we maintain control of what's going on within our own lands. And that's what I'm absolutely adamant about right now, is that we as Canadians, this is the restructuring of the Canadian economy. And I don't want to be owned by the United States, frankly.
What a great point, because those are words to live by and those are words to go to work by every day. And you've always been very involved and supportive of the First Nations leadership and communities in their pursuit. And these are the things that you're talking about. improved services, opportunities, equity positions. But what is the difference today when you helped Five Nations 30 years ago and even Wate 20 years ago? Things were different. What's different today? Everybody seems to be pushing for, but what's changed? What's different?
Dean, you and I have been involved in this most of our careers. An awful lot of people in the last 5 to 7 years discovered the North. Okay? I can't tell you how many Northern experts from downtown Toronto I've met in the last 5 years. I can't tell you how many, look, in my view of the world, there are people who do things and there are people who go to conferences. And I'm shocked at how many conferences are going on across this country on a weekly basis talking
There's
about
lots.
Right, exactly what we're talking about. But, conferences are conferences. That's not where this stuff happens. You know that. It's on the ground. It's with your hands dirty. It's beating your brains out. It's not sleeping at night, praying that, and hoping the next phone call isn't going to blow you right out of the water. That's how this stuff gets done. And that's what, I think that. You've lived it. That's what we do. That's the only way that you maintain control of the resources that you're working with.
We've touched on all the hard items that are in most cases intangible until you get involved. So give us a few final words on what you think people need to hear about the hard part of getting a project to reality.
Well, I think the difficulty is understanding that as we go forward, there is a very specific model for how we do infrastructure projects. You can go to Price Waterhouse and they can give you studies. All of those things are in place. Okay, engineers will show you how to do this. Accounting firms will show you how to do that. You can bring any number of project managers into the room that can tell you how to do A, B, C, and we'll do Gantt charts for you, and we'll lay out a perfect scenario and a perfect picture, providing that somebody's actually hiring them. Providing that there is a viable project in front of them. They can do all of those things. The difficulty, the thing to understand is, how you get to that point. And that's the thing that, you and I are talking about, but that's the thing that's missed in the conferences. Okay, because in my view, everybody goes to conferences to sell themselves. So everybody's looking for somebody to allow them to do the Gantt charts. I don't know how to emphasize this more. If you don't get in the front end of the deal, there is no back end.
Lloyd, I want to thank you for joining me today and bringing the reality piece to where things start. Such great information for those listening to take in. In my next episode, we're going to discuss planning from the First Nations perspective with Pat Chilton, CEO of Five Nations Energy. This will be a great continuation of this discussion today from their side of the fact. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening to this episode of Powerful Connections. Get in touch with me on my website at dgg5advising.com or find me on LinkedIn at Dean G. Gation. See ya in the next episode.